At 7:38 on the morning of October 17, 1953, Chief Pipeline Engineer Leslie Peterson stood on a ridge above the Coquihalla River Valley in British Columbia, watching the first section of 24-inch steel pipe being lowered into a trench carved through terrain that American engineers had deemed impossible for pipeline construction. 46 years old, 22 years in petroleum engineering, he was supervising the construction of Canada's first trans-mountain crude oil pipeline, a project that would either prove Alberta oil could reach Pacific tidewater or demonstrate that the Rocky Mountains were an insurmountable barrier to westward energy export. The numbers made conventional pipeline engineers nervous. 1,150 kilometers from Edmonton to Burnaby, crossing the Continental Divide at 1,200 meters elevation, and descending through Coquihalla Canyon, where gradients exceeded 8% and winter avalanches buried everything. Operating pressure of 1,200 pounds per square inch, transmission capacity of 150,000 barrels per day. More crude than any Canadian pipeline had ever moved through mountain terrain. Imperial Oil had discovered Leduc in 1947, proving Alberta contained massive petroleum reserves. Subsequent discoveries confirmed that Western Canada could become a major oil producer. But Alberta was landlocked. Eastern refineries were 3,000 kilometers away. American refineries on the Gulf Coast offered markets, but Canadian crude had to compete with Texas and Oklahoma production. The Pacific Coast offered something different: direct tanker access to California refineries and Asian markets. Vancouver had deep water terminals, but getting Alberta crude to Vancouver required a pipeline through the Rockies, terrain where avalanches, unstable slopes, and extreme weather had defeated previous attempts. Peterson had spent 2 years planning the route, identifying the least impossible crossing through the mountains. His crews would build through conditions that killed workers regularly. The first pipe section settled into the trench. Welders began joining sections. Trans-mountain pipeline had begun. The problem started in 1949 when Alberta's oil production exceeded local refining capacity. The province produced 30,000 barrels per day. Alberta refineries processed 12,000 barrels per day, like the surplus needed markets. The interprovincial pipeline, completed in 1950, carried crude east to Superior, Wisconsin, then south to American Midwest refineries. But eastern markets were finite. Alberta needed Pacific access for long-term growth. Trans Mountain Pipeline Company was incorporated in 1951 with a mandate to build Canada's first pipeline to the Pacific coast. The company raised $93 million, an enormous sum in 1951, and hired Peterson as chief engineer. But the route selection took 2 years. The pipeline would follow the North Thompson River Valley from Edmonton to Kamloops, then cross the Coast Mountains through Coquihalla Pass to Hope, then descend the Fraser Valley to Burnaby. Total distance, 1,150 kilometers. Maximum elevation, 1,200 meters. The Coquihalla section presented the worst terrain. The pass descended 800 meters over 80 kilometers, an average gradient of 10 meters per kilometer. In winter, snow depths exceeded 6 meters, and avalanches swept down every major slope. The terrain was too steep for conventional pipeline construction equipment. Chief Construction Supervisor Donald McKay, 49 years old, veteran of Alaska highway construction during World War II, took charge of the mountain sections. McKay understood building in extreme terrain. He had supervised crews working at -50 in northern Canada. But the Coquihalla presented different challenges. Slopes too steep to anchor equipment, a snowpack that buried work sites, and avalanche danger that could kill entire crews. Construction began in 1952. Prairie sections proceeded normally. Crews completed 5 to 8 kilometers per day across flat terrain. But the mountain sections slowed to 500 meters per day as workers blasted rock, stabilized slopes, and built access roads through wilderness. And if you want to see how Leslie Peterson engineered Canada's first trans-mountain pipeline through terrain that American engineers had abandoned as impossible, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Trans Mountain. The Coquihalla construction required innovations that standard pipeline engineering hadn't contemplated. Workers built wooden trestles to support pipe across gorges, where excavating trenches was impossible. They installed pipe on mountainsides using cables and winches anchored to trees. They blasted tunnels through rock where surface routes would face constant avalanche burial. 5 workers died during mountain construction. 2 were killed in an avalanche near the summit. 1 died when a cable supporting pipe across a gorge snapped. 2 died in a rockfall during tunnel excavation. On the names: Robert Harrison, 34. Michael Dubois, 38. Thomas Chen, 29. James Peterson, 41. William McDonald, 36. The pipeline reached Burnaby in October 1953, 18 months after construction began. The first crude oil flowed from Edmonton on October 17, 1953. Alberta oil reached the Westridge Marine Terminal 72 hours later. Capacity: 150,000 barrels per day. Where the terminal consisted of storage tanks with 1.2 million barrels capacity and a single loading berth where tankers could take on crude for transport to California refineries. The first tanker, a converted World War II Liberty ship, loaded 80,000 barrels on November 3, 1953, and departed for San Francisco. Trans Mountain had proven the concept. Alberta crude could reach Pacific tidewater. But 150,000 barrels per day was insufficient for Alberta's growing production. The first expansion came in 1957, increasing capacity to 225,000 barrels per day through additional pumping stations and pressure increases. A second expansion in 1970 brought capacity to 300,000 barrels per day by installing larger pumps and additional storage. For 50 years, Trans Mountain operated at 300,000 barrels per day. A critical export route, but secondary to pipelines serving American Gulf Coast refineries. Then, Asian demand transformed global oil markets. China's oil consumption increased from 3 million barrels per day in 1990 to 14 million barrels per day by 2020. India's consumption tripled. Southeast Asian economies became major crude importers. Asian markets offered higher prices than American refineries. Premiums of $5 to $15 per barrel depending on market conditions. But Trans Mountain's 300,000 barrel capacity couldn't accommodate Alberta's production, which had grown to 3.7 million barrels per day. Most Alberta crude flowed south through Enbridge and Keystone pipelines to American refineries, selling at discounts because Canadian producers had no alternate markets. Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX, was proposed in 2012 to triple capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. The expansion would twin the existing pipeline along most of the route, add new pumping stations, and expand Westridge Terminal to accommodate larger tankers. The project faced immediate opposition. Our environmental groups opposed any expansion of oil sands production. Indigenous communities demanded consultation on projects crossing traditional territories. British Columbia's government opposed increased tanker traffic through Vancouver Harbor. Legal challenges delayed construction for 7 years. The federal government purchased Trans Mountain in 2018 for $4.5 billion to ensure the expansion proceeded. Construction began in 2019, and the project cost ballooned to $30.9 billion the most expensive pipeline ever built in Canada. TMX was completed in May 2024. The expanded system now transports 890,000 barrels per day from Edmonton to Burnaby. Westridge Terminal can load Aframax tankers, vessels carrying 750,000 barrels, enabling efficient export to Asian markets. Today, Trans Mountain is Canada's only pipeline delivering crude oil to Pacific tidewater, and the system moves approximately 890,000 barrels per day, 18.7 million gallons, through 1,150 kilometers of pipeline crossing the Rocky Mountains and Coast Mountains. The pipeline supplies Canadian refineries in Burnaby and Washington State and enables tanker exports to refineries in California, China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Approximately 400,000 barrels per day are exported by tanker, representing 40% of system capacity. And Alberta's oil industry depends on Trans Mountain operating normally. A prolonged shutdown, whether from pipeline rupture in the Coquihalla, earthquake damaging the terminal at Burnaby, or coordinated attacks on pumping stations, would immediately strand 890,000 barrels per day of Alberta production. Alberta producers would shut in wells within weeks as storage capacity filled. The province's oil production would decline by 24%. The economic impact to Alberta would exceed $300 million per day. Canadian crude prices would collapse as producers competed for limited pipeline capacity to American markets. The Western Canadian Select benchmark, already trading at discounts to West Texas Intermediate, would see differentials widen to $20 to $30 per barrel. The vulnerability became apparent in 2020 when protesters blocked railroad access to the Westridge terminal for 2 weeks. Crude shipments stopped, non-storage tanks filled. Alberta producers reduced output. The federal government intervened to clear the blockade. Unlike other Canadian pipelines with alternate routes, Trans Mountain has no replacement. It's the only system connecting Alberta to Pacific tidewater. Enbridge goes south to the Gulf Coast. Trans-Canada goes east to Ontario. Trans Mountain is the only western route. Leslie Peterson retired from Trans Mountain in 1968 after overseeing the pipeline's first 15 years of operation. He died in 1981 at age 74. The Coquihalla route he selected remains the only viable pipeline corridor through the Coast Mountains. Donald McKay continued working on pipeline construction across Western Canada until his retirement in 1975. He died in 1993, age 90. The mountain construction techniques he pioneered became standard for pipelines in challenging terrain. Trans Mountain operates 24 hours per day, 365 days per year. Control centers in Edmonton and Burnaby monitor pressure, flow, and pump performance across 1,150 kilometers. Pumps run continuously, maintaining pressure that pushes 890,000 barrels of crude oil west from Alberta. Oil flows through pipe buried 1.2 meters underground in the prairies and anchored to mountainsides in the Coquihalla. And somewhere in the Fraser Valley, south, a tanker is being loaded at Westridge Terminal. 750,000 barrels of Alberta crude destined for Asian refineries, flowing through infrastructure that started with Leslie Peterson watching workers lower pipe into a trench on October 17, 1953. The system continues. Canada's Pacific oil access depends on it continuing. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about infrastructure that connects resources to global markets, real people, real engineering, real economic stakes. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if you've worked in pipelines or energy. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Leslie Peterson, Donald McKay, and the 5 workers who died building this system don't disappear into silence.